I'm never wrapping brisket in foil again, and once an old pitmaster outside Lockhart showed me why, I understood exactly why so many backyard cooks who copy the 3-2-1 method from ribs onto a full packer brisket end up with something that tastes steamed instead of smoked. Foil has a place, brisket isn't it. What he showed me instead is a technique that's been quietly running Central Texas pits for decades, and it beats foil on bark, on flavor, and honestly on consistency too, once you understand what's actually happening inside that wrap. By the end of this, you'll know exactly why foil works against a brisket, the way it doesn't against ribs, the actual technique that replaces it, the timing and temperature adjustments that make it work, and the mistakes that turn even a good brisket into a disappointing one. Let's start with why 3-2-1 doesn't actually belong anywhere near a brisket conversation in the first place. Because that mismatch is where a lot of home cooks go wrong before they've even lit a fire. 3-2-1 is a ribs method built around 3 hours unwrapped, 2 hours wrapped in foil, 1 hour unwrapped again to firm the bark back up. It works reasonably well on ribs because ribs are thin, relatively fast cooking, and forgiving of the moisture foil traps against the surface. A whole packer brisket is a completely different animal. 12 to 16 pounds of dense muscle and connective tissue that needs 12 to 16 hours to properly render, and applying a rib scale wrapping formula to something that size misunderstands the entire problem brisket actually presents. Brisket doesn't need a fixed formula. It needs a wrap strategy that responds to what the meat itself is doing, and that's exactly where foil starts working against you instead of for you. Let's talk about what foil actually does to a brisket during that long cook, because understanding the mechanism is what makes the alternative make sense. Foil creates a fully sealed environment. Once a brisket goes into foil, it stops smoking almost entirely, since there's no airflow left to carry any more smoke onto the meat's surface, and it starts essentially braising in its own trapped steam and rendered fat for the remainder of the cook. That trapped steam does push the brisket through the stall fast, which is exactly why foil got popular as a stall-defeating trick in the first place. But that same trapped moisture sits directly against the bark you spent the first several hours building, and bark sitting in a pool of steam for the back half of a long cook softens, sometimes all the way down to something closer to wet cardboard than the deep, dark, peppery crust a proper brisket is supposed to carry. You end up with a brisket that's tender, genuinely, but tastes like it stopped being smoked halfway through the cook, because it did. The old pitmaster who taught me this called foil the quitter's wrap, not because it doesn't work, but because it solves the stall by giving up on everything else that makes a brisket taste like a brisket instead of a pot roast. Now let's talk about the actual technique that replaces it, because this is the part that changes how you'll cook brisket from here forward. Butcher paper, specifically pink or peach butcher paper rated for smoking, wrapped at the stall instead of foil. This isn't a new idea. Texas Monthly and half the legendary Central Texas barbecue joints have run paper for generations, and the reason comes down to exactly the mechanism foil gets wrong. Paper is breathable. It lets some moisture and steam pass through the fibers rather than trapping everything in a sealed pocket, which means the brisket still gets through the stall considerably faster than riding unwrapped the whole way, but the bark underneath stays intact instead of steaming into mush. You're not choosing between speed and bark the way foil forces you to. Paper gets you real acceleration through that stalled temperature range while protecting most of what you built in the first several hours. Let's talk about timing, because this is where a lot of the actual skill in this technique lives. Run your brisket unwrapped from the start, same as you always would, holding your pit at 250 to 275 degrees with a clean burning post oak fire. Watch the internal temperature climb steadily until it hits the stall, typically somewhere in the 160 to 170 range, where it'll flatten out and seem to stop climbing no matter how consistent your fire is. That's your wrap point, not a fixed hour mark on a clock, because brisket size, outside temperature, and how your specific pit runs all shift exactly when that stall actually happens. Wrap tight in 2 layers of butcher paper, seam side down, and get it back on the pit at the same temperature you've been running. From there, the brisket typically pushes through the rest of the cook to a finished internal temperature around 203 degrees, checking for that probe tender feel. The probe sliding in with almost no resistance, rather than trusting the number alone. A full packer at this pace usually runs somewhere between 12 and 14 hours total, wrap included, which is close to what an unwrapped cook takes, but without nearly as long a stall dragging out the middle of it. Let's talk about a detail the old Pitmaster specifically drilled into me, because it's the one most people skip even when they've switched to paper. Don't wrap too early. The exact same mistake that ruins a foil-wrapped brisket ruins a paper-wrapped one too, just less dramatically. If you wrap before the bark's actually had time to set, before it's developed real color and a slightly dry, tacky to the touch surface, you're locking in a soft, underdeveloped crust, regardless of which wrap material you're using. Paper forgives a slightly early wrap better than foil does, because it's not fully sealing in moisture, but it doesn't forgive it completely. Wait for genuine bark, not just genuine color, before that brisket goes into paper. If you want the complete written breakdown of the exact timing, temperature charts, and wrap decisions I run on every single brisket at my own pit, I put the whole thing together in the Texas BBQ playbook. Links in the description, and there's a QR code on screen right now if you'd rather scan it than go type it in. All right, back to the wrap. Let's talk about the actual difference in finished bark between the two methods, because this is genuinely where the whole argument lives. A foil-wrapped brisket, pulled and rested, typically has a bark that's gone soft enough to press in with light finger pressure, glossy from trapped fat and moisture rather than dry and set. A paper-wrapped brisket holds a bark that's still got real texture, some give but genuine structure underneath it, closer to what you'd get riding fully unwrapped, but without sacrificing the hours of extra cook time that unwrapped method demands to push through the stall on its own. Slice into both side by side, and the paper-wrapped brisket holds its shape better too. Less of that fully collapsed, almost shredding texture foil tends to produce. More of the clean slice with a slight give that a well-executed brisket is actually supposed to have. Let's talk about smoke flavor specifically, because this is the second major place paper outperforms foil. Since paper isn't creating a fully sealed environment, some limited smoke absorption keeps happening even after the wrap goes on, where foil shuts that down completely the moment it's sealed. That means a paper-wrapped brisket carries noticeably more smoke character through to the final bite compared to a foil-wrapped one, even when both were cooked over the exact same fire for the exact same total number of hours. Foil isn't just softening your bark, it's cutting off your smoke flavor development early, hours before the brisket's actually finished cooking. Let's talk about resting, because this matters as much for the final result as anything that happens on the pit itself. Rest the wrapped brisket still in that same butcher paper in a dry cooler for at least an hour, ideally closer to 2 before slicing. That extended rest lets the internal juices redistribute fully rather than running out onto the cutting board the moment you make the first cut. And paper's breathability actually helps here too, letting a small amount of residual steam escape during that rest, rather than continuing to soften the bark the way a sealed foil pouch would during the same resting period. Let's talk about the mistakes now, because these are the ones that actually separate someone getting the full benefit of this method from someone who switches to paper and doesn't understand why their results didn't improve much. The first mistake is wrapping too early, before real bark has actually set, which I covered, but it's worth repeating because it's genuinely the most common way this whole technique underperforms. The second mistake is treating paper exactly like foil once it's wrapped, meaning cranking the pit temperature up aggressively to try to force a faster finish the way some people do with a foil-wrapped brisket. Paper's breathability means it responds differently to a temperature spike than a sealed foil pouch does, and pushing your pit too hot after wrapping in paper can actually dry out the exposed portions faster than the moisture inside can compensate for. The third mistake is using a single layer of paper instead of two. A single layer doesn't hold up as well against a long cook, sometimes tearing or wearing thin by the time the brisket's actually done, especially with a heavier, fattier brisket that's rendering a real amount of liquid fat against that paper for hours. 2 layers, wrapped tight, holds up considerably more reliably across a full cook. The fourth mistake is skipping the extended rest specifically because paper feels less like it needs one compared to a foil-wrapped brisket sitting in its own trapped juices. The rest matters just as much regardless of wrap material, and rushing it undoes real quality regardless of how well the actual cook went. Let's cover a few more details worth knowing before you try this on your next brisket. Butcher paper specifically rated for smoking, sometimes labeled peach paper or pink butcher paper, is what you want here, not regular parchment paper or wax paper, neither of which is rated for the sustained heat exposure a long brisket cook involves. It's worth ordering a roll online or checking a specialty butcher supply store if your regular grocery store doesn't carry it, since substituting an unrated paper isn't a safe swap here. Fat side placement still matters the same way it always has, regardless of which wrap method you're using. Positioned according to where your specific pit's heat source sits, protecting the leaner side of the brisket from direct heat exposure through the entire cook, wrap included. Trim consistently before the brisket ever goes on the pit, since an unevenly trimmed brisket cooks unevenly regardless of wrap material, and no wrap strategy fixes a trimming mistake made hours earlier. A few questions people ask me regularly once they've tried switching from foil to paper themselves. What if you've been running foil for years and are nervous about the switch affecting your total cook time significantly? Expect your total cook time to run somewhat longer with paper than it did with foil, typically an hour or two more on a full packer, since paper doesn't accelerate the stall quite as dramatically as a fully sealed foil pouch does. Plan your cook start time accordingly rather than assuming an identical schedule to what foil produced. What if your butcher paper keeps tearing during the wrap itself? Make sure you're using paper genuinely rated for this use, rather than a thinner, lower quality roll, and wrap with slightly looser folds rather than pulling the paper taut against sharp bone edges or fat cap corners that can puncture through a tight wrap under tension. What if you want some of foil's speed without fully giving up on paper's bark benefits? Some Pitmasters run what's sometimes called the Texas crutch hybrid, wrapping in paper through the stall and only switching briefly to foil in the final hour if a specific brisket's running behind schedule and you genuinely need to speed up the finish. Though understand you're trading some bark quality for that speed and exactly the portion of the cook where you make that switch. What if you're cooking a smaller brisket, not a full packer, and wondering if this technique still applies? The same principles hold at any size, watching for the actual stall rather than a fixed time, wrapping in 2 layers of paper once real bark has set, though total cook time will run shorter, proportionally to the smaller size. That's genuinely the whole method, start to finish. Questions included: butcher paper instead of foil, wrapped at the actual stall rather than a fixed clock time, watching for real bark before that wrap ever goes on. 2 layers instead of 1, a temperature held steady rather than cranked up to compensate, and a proper extended rest once it comes off the pit. More smoke flavor carried through to the final bite. Bark that holds real structure instead of steaming soft, and a brisket that tastes like it was smoked the entire way through instead of smoked for half the cook and braised for the rest. Grab a roll of real butcher paper before your next brisket, wrap at the stall instead of on a fixed schedule, and see for yourself why so many Texas pits gave up on foil generations ago.